Count one, murder in the second degree. What's your verdict?
Guilty.
Some families collapse quietly. Others explode in ways that leave scars across entire countries. Tonight is not about strangers breaking in through the dark. It's about sons who walked through front doors, sat at dinner tables, accepted money, love, and protection, and then decided their own blood was disposable. These are not crimes of impulse. They are betrayals built slowly, fueled by lies, entitlement, obsession, and fear of exposure. Each story pulls back another layer of something far more disturbing than violence alone. Because when a son turns on the people who raised him, the damage doesn't end with death. It echoes forever. Before we go any further, make sure you subscribe if you're here for deep, fully researched, dark documentaries told without shortcuts. These stories take time, detail, and uncomfortable honesty, and you won't find them told this way anywhere else. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from right now? Delmar, New York. 2004. On the morning of November 15th, something was wrong in the Porco household long before anyone realized how bad it truly was. Peter Porco was late for work. That alone raised concern. He was a disciplined man, a senior clerk at the county courthouse, known for his rigid routines. When hours passed with no sign of him, a colleague decided to drive to the quiet suburban home in Delmar to check in. What waited inside would become one of the most disturbing family crime scenes in modern American history. Peter Porco had been attacked in his own home with an axe. His wife, Joan Porco, lay nearby, also brutally wounded. Blood marked the floors, the stairs, the walls. Yet, the most haunting detail was not the weapon, or even the violence itself. It was what happened after the attack. Peter Porco did not die immediately. Despite catastrophic head injuries that should have left him unconscious, Peter moved through parts of his morning as if his body was operating on memory alone. He walked downstairs. He prepared paperwork. He packed a briefcase. He attempted to shave. Only after completing fragments of his routine did he finally collapse, succumbing to his injuries. Doctors would later say his actions defied medical logic, turning the crime scene into something almost surreal. Joan Porco survived, but her survival would become the emotional fault line that split this case in half. From the outside, the Porcos looked like an ordinary, successful family, a stable home, a respected career, a son enrolled in college with a future ahead of him. That son was Christopher Porco. Behind the image, however, Christopher's life was unraveling. He had been lying for years, forging documents, falsifying grades, manipulating financial records. He presented himself as a successful student while quietly failing out of school. Credit cards were maxed. Loans were taken under false pretenses. The pressure was closing in. According to prosecutors, exposure was inevitable, and Christopher knew it. Investigators quickly focused on him, not because of emotion, but because of evidence. Surveillance footage, toll data, and transaction records built a timeline centered around Christopher's distinctive yellow Jeep. The data suggested the vehicle left the Rochester area late at night, traveled toward Delmar, and returned before morning. The window was narrow, tight enough to spark debate, wide enough, the prosecution argued, to make the trip. The alleged murder weapon was painfully ordinary, an axe from the family garage, not stolen, not planted, just there, waiting. But no piece of evidence carried more weight than Joan Porco herself. Early on, police reported that when Joan was asked whether her son had attacked them, she nodded. A subtle movement, barely visible, but devastating if true. Later, Joan said she had no memory of doing that. As her recovery progressed, she took a firm and public stance. Christopher was innocent. He did not attack them. She defended him relentlessly, even after his arrest. That decision reshaped everything. At trial, jurors were forced to navigate a brutal contradiction, a mountain of circumstantial evidence pointing toward the son, and a surviving victim insisting that son was not the attacker. Prosecutors argued motive, opportunity, and method. They laid out Christopher's financial deception and the fear of being exposed. They walked jurors through the travel timeline and the weapon. The defense hammered one question again and again. How could a mother be wrong about who nearly killed her? In 2006, the jury answered anyway. Christopher Porco was convicted of second-degree murder for killing his father and attempted murder for the attack on his mother. He was sentenced to 25 years to life on each charge, to be served consecutively, a minimum of 50 years before parole eligibility, a life effectively sealed behind prison walls. But the verdict did not end the story. Joan Porco never wavered. She continued to fight for her son's innocence, appearing in interviews, filing motions, and challenging the narrative that had locked him away. Appeals came and went. Courts upheld the conviction. Yet the case refused to die quietly. Years later, a post-conviction motion reopened legal arguments, assigning a special prosecutor due to conflicts of interest. As of the mid-2020s, the legal process remained active, not overturned, not resolved, just suspended in tension. Christopher Porco remains incarcerated. Joan Porco remains convinced the wrong man is in prison. And the case remains a permanent argument about evidence, memory, denial, and the terrifying possibility that the truth may never feel complete. What makes this story linger is not just the violence, but the loyalty. A mother nearly killed by an axe who still refuses to condemn her son. A jury that chose evidence over blood. A son who insists he is innocent while serving a sentence, long enough to erase an entire lifetime. And as unsettling as this case is, it is only the beginning, because Christopher Porco did not kill to become famous. He did not kill for ideology. He killed, prosecutors said, to protect a lie. The next son would take deception even further, slaughtering his entire family, then spray painting hatred on the walls to shift the blame. And that story begins in Australia. North Ryde, Sydney, 2001. On the night of July 10, 2001, a quiet suburban street in North Ryde became the setting for one of Australia's most disturbing family betrayals. Inside a neat, respectable home, 3 members of the same family were murdered in a calculated and deliberate attack. By the time morning arrived, only one person inside that house was still alive, the son who had done it. And he was already pretending to be devastated. To the outside world, the Gonzalez family looked like a model success story. Teddy and Mary Gonzalez were Filipino immigrants who had built a stable life through discipline, sacrifice, and relentless hard work. Education was sacred in their household. Failure was not something that was discussed lightly. Their daughter Claudine was 18 years old, intelligent, motivated, and deeply loved. Their son, Seth, was supposed to be the proof that everything they sacrificed had been worth it. A law student, a future, professional, a source of pride. But none of it was real. By 2001, Seth Gonzalez had already failed out of university. His legal studies existed only on paper he created himself. He forged transcripts, invented grades, rewrote reality every time his parents asked how school was going. For years, he lived inside a performance, carefully maintaining the illusion of success while his actual life quietly collapsed. And he knew the truth could not stay hidden forever. If his parents discovered the lies, everything would fall apart. The financial support would end. The respect would evaporate. The future he pretended to be building would be exposed as fiction. To Seth, that exposure felt worse than death. So instead of confessing, he chose erasure. That night, he waited until the timing felt right. His father, Teddy, was attacked first. There was no argument, no confrontation, no final chance for explanation. Inside the home, Teddy had spent his life working to provide. His own son stabbed him to death. Not long after, Mary Gonzalez returned home carrying groceries, expecting an ordinary evening. She stepped through the front door, believing she was safe. She was killed moments later by the child she had raised and trusted. Finally, Seth went to his sister's bedroom. Claudine was still wearing her school uniform. She was a teenager with plans, friends, and a future that had nothing to do with Seth's lies. Prosecutors later made it clear that her death served no purpose other than convenience. She was part of the truth Seth wanted to erase. 3 people were dead, but Seth was not finished shaping the story. After the murders, he staged the scene. He took spray paint and covered the walls with racial slurs, deliberately framing the killings as a hate crime. The message was calculated. He wanted police hunting for imaginary attackers. He wanted sympathy. He wanted distance between himself and the truth. Then came the performance. Seth cried in front of relatives. He clung to friends. He went on television, his voice trembling as he begged the public for information about the killers. To anyone watching, he looked shattered. A young man whose family had been destroyed by faceless violence. Detectives were not convinced. The crime scene raised immediate questions. The graffiti had been applied after the murders, not during a struggle. There were no signs of forced entry, no defensive wounds on Seth's body. His story shifted slightly each time he told it, changing just enough to explain the latest inconsistency. As investigators dug deeper, the motive became impossible to ignore. They uncovered Seth's academic fraud, years of deception layered on top of one another, failed courses, withdrawals, fabricated documents. He had been living off his parents' belief in him while knowing that belief was about to shatter. In Seth's mind, murder solved the problem permanently. At trial, prosecutors dismantled the lie piece by piece. They walked the jury through the timeline of the murders. They exposed the staged hate crime. They replayed Seth's media appearances, now stripped of innocence by context. What once looked like grief now looked like rehearsal. The most devastating testimonies centered on Claudine. Jurors were reminded that she trusted her brother completely, that she died not because she threatened him, but because she shared his last name. The verdict came swiftly. Seth Gonzalez was convicted of murdering his parents and his sister. In 2004, he was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The judge described the crimes as selfish beyond comprehension, condemning not only the murders, but the attempt to exploit racial hatred to escape responsibility. Even behind bars, Seth refused to let the story rest. Over the years, he filed multiple appeals, challenging evidence and procedure, each one reopening wounds for surviving relatives. Every appeal failed. The conviction stood. The sentence remained. Teddy and Mary Gonzalez spent their lives building a future for their children. Claudine had barely begun hers. All of it ended in a single night, erased by a son who believed his lies mattered more than human life. And yet, as calculated as this betrayal was, Seth still committed the violence himself. The next son would take a different path. He would outsource the killing, stage himself as a victim, and then watch as his surviving father begged the state not to execute him. Stafford, Texas. 2003. Process is not just the planning, but the patience. Where the previous son used violence with his own hands, this one sat through dinner, smiled across the table, accepted a gift meant to celebrate his future, and calmly waited for strangers to do the killing for him. On the evening of December 10, 2003, the Whitaker family went out to dinner together at a restaurant in Stafford, Texas. It was supposed to be a celebration. Kent and Patricia Whitaker believed their oldest son, Bart, was about to graduate. They were proud, relieved, certain that years of support had paid off. During the evening, they presented Bart with a Rolex watch, a symbol of success, a reward for an achievement that did not exist. Bart Whitaker was 23 years old, and almost everything his family believed about him was a lie. He had dropped out of college long before. There was no graduation, no law school, no future quietly unfolding. For years, Bart had constructed an elaborate fiction, feeding his parents updates about classes, exams, and progress, all while drifting further away from reality. And just like the sons before him, he knew exposure was coming. Instead of confessing, Bart decided to erase the problem entirely. This was not a spontaneous decision. Evidence later showed Bart had floated the idea of killing his family before. At least one acquaintance told police Bart had previously asked him to act as the shooter. When that fell apart, Bart adjusted the plan. He recruited others. He eventually conspired with Chris Brazier and Stephen Champagne. Bart provided what they needed: a key to the house, the alarm code, instructions. He did not want chaos. He wanted precision. After dinner, the family returned home. As they approached the front door, Bart deliberately stayed behind, telling them he had forgotten his phone in his vehicle. While his parents and younger brother Kevin went inside, Bart lingered outside, positioning himself carefully away from what was about to happen. Inside the house, the attack began. Kevin Whitaker was shot near the entryway. Patricia Whitaker was shot and killed shortly afterward. Kent Whitaker was shot through the chest and arm. Gravely wounded, he collapsed and played dead, listening as his wife and son lay dying only feet away. Bart then entered the house and staged his role. He was shot in the arm, a carefully chosen injury meant to sell the illusion that he too had been a victim of a random home invasion. When police arrived, Bart Whitaker was treated as a survivor, a traumatized son who had narrowly escaped death. For a short time, the story held. But investigators began to notice things that did not add up. There were no signs of forced entry. The timing was too clean. Bart's wound did not align with his account. And as detectives pulled on those threads, the entire narrative unraveled. Chris Brazier was arrested. Under pressure, he confessed. He told investigators everything. Bart Whitaker had planned the murders. He had paid for them. He had provided access to the home. He was not the victim. He was the architect. As police continued digging, they recovered a duffel bag thrown into a lake. Inside were guns, clothing, Bart's phone, and other items meant to disappear forever. The evidence tied the conspiracy together in a way Bart could not escape. Bart fled to Mexico as suspicion closed in. He was eventually captured and returned to Texas to face capital murder charges. At trial, prosecutors dismantled the illusion Bart had spent years building. They showed jurors the fake graduation story, the planning, the paid killers, his own admissions that the idea had been his. The motive, they argued, was self-preservation and greed. The Whitaker family had significant assets, and Bart stood to benefit once they were gone. Yet, even in this case, the story fractured in a way that made it unforgettable. Kent Whitaker survived, and instead of demanding the harshest punishment, he did the unthinkable. He forgave his son. Kent publicly opposed Bart's execution. He attended hearings. He wrote letters. He spoke out repeatedly, saying that killing Bart would not bring back Patricia or Kevin, that executing his only remaining child would simply add another death to an already unbearable list. The jury convicted Bart Whitaker of capital murder. He was sentenced to death, despite never pulling the trigger himself. Appeals followed. Years passed. Execution dates were set and delayed. Then, in February 2018, just minutes before Bart was scheduled to die, the Texas Board of Pardons and Paroles unanimously recommended commutation. Governor Greg Abbott accepted it. Bart's sentence was reduced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Bart Whitaker was removed from death row and transferred into the general prison system, where he remains today. There is no clean ending here, only a question that refuses to go away. When a father forgives the son who destroyed his family, what does justice even mean anymore? And as disturbing as that question is, the next story strips away forgiveness entirely. Because the next son did not hire killers. He did not stage a home invasion. He did something far more grotesque. He murdered his parents, locked their bodies behind a door, and then invited the entire town over to celebrate. Port St. Lucie, Florida, 2011. If the last story blurred the line between justice and forgiveness, this one erases the line between horror and disbelief altogether. Because this son did not run. He did not hide. He did not even pretend to grieve. He killed his parents and then turned their home into a party venue, as if noise and laughter could bury the truth locked behind a bedroom door. In July of 2011, Tyler Hadley was 17 years old, still in high school, still legally a child. To classmates, he was awkward, desperate for attention, and increasingly erratic. He talked big, acted tough, and wanted to be seen as dangerous rather than invisible. Drugs had become part of his daily life. Authority meant nothing to him, and beneath all of it sat a growing resentment toward the two people trying to hold his life together. Blake and Mary Jo Hadley were not perfect parents, but they were present. They worked, they provided, they worried. They tried to rein in a son who was slipping further away every month. Tyler saw their concern not as care, but as control. Weeks before the murders, Tyler began saying something chilling to friends. He told them he was going to kill his parents and throw a party afterward. Most laughed it off. Teenagers exaggerate. They shock for attention. No one believed he meant it. Tyler meant every word. On the afternoon of July 16th, Mary Jo Hadley was sitting at the family computer. The house was quiet. Tyler came up behind her holding a hammer he had taken from the garage. There was no argument, no warning. He struck her, repeatedly. When Blake Hadley heard the noise and ran to help, Tyler turned the hammer on him as well. In minutes, both parents were dead on the floor of their own home. Then Tyler began cleaning. He dragged their bodies into the master bedroom, covered them with towels and household items, pushed furniture against the door, locked it. He scrubbed what he could, but blood has a way of lingering no matter how hard you try to erase it. And then he did something no one could rationalize. He logged onto Facebook and posted a message inviting people over. A party, no parents home, do not tell anyone. The message spread fast. As the sun went down, cars began lining the street. Teenagers poured into the house. Music blasted. Red cups filled the rooms. At some points, estimates reached over 50 guests. They danced, drank, laughed, and trashed the home, completely unaware that 2 bodies lay decomposing just feet away. Tyler moved through the crowd, wired and restless. Some guests noticed strange details. Family photos were missing from the walls. The house smelled off. When asked where his parents were, Tyler gave different answers to different people. Out of town, sleeping, not around. At one point, he told a small group the truth. He said he had killed his parents. Most laughed, assuming it was dark humor meant to impress. But one friend sensed something was wrong. Tyler took him to the master bedroom door. It was locked. Inside was the reality no one at that party was prepared to face. The friend left, shaken but did not immediately go to police. The party continued into the night. By morning, rumors had spread. Someone finally tipped off authorities. When police arrived, they found the aftermath of chaos. Cups everywhere, bottles stacked, ashtrays overflowing. But the smell told them this was more than a mess. Officers forced open the master bedroom door and found Blake and Mary Jo Hadley exactly where Tyler had left them, covered, forgotten. Tyler was arrested without resistance. Investigators uncovered overwhelming evidence of premeditation. Friends testified that Tyler had talked about the murders in advance. His Facebook posts were recovered. Witnesses described the party. The hammer was traced back to the garage. Tyler himself admitted what he had done. In court, prosecutors described the crime as calculated and monstrous. Not just the murders, but the celebration afterward. They argued that Tyler did not kill in a moment of rage. He killed so he could feel powerful, seen, feared. The defense pointed to his age, his mental health, his drug use. They argued he was an unstable teenager, not a calculating killer. But jurors had seen enough. In 2014, Tyler Hadley was sentenced to 2 life terms without parole. Later changes to juvenile sentencing law required a review, and his sentence was adjusted to life with the possibility of review after 25 years. A legal technicality that did nothing to soften the facts. The judge's words cut through the courtroom. You slaughtered the 2 people who loved you most, and then you celebrated. As of the mid-2020s, Tyler Hadley remains in prison. No crowd, no music, no attention. Just the silence he never seemed able to tolerate. And if this case feels like the bottom, it is not. Because the next sons were not driven by anger, attention, or desperation. They wanted something else entirely. They wanted to be remembered. Broken Arrow, Oklahoma, 2015. What happens when the desire for attention mutates into something far darker than validation? When being seen is no longer enough, and only infamy will do? The next story is not about money or lies collapsing under pressure. It is about 2 brothers who believed mass murder was a path to worship. In the summer of 2015, the Baver family lived a quiet, isolated life in Broken Arrow, Oklahoma. David and April Bever homeschooled their 7 children and kept them largely removed from the outside world. Neighbors rarely saw the kids. There were no sleepovers, no neighborhood friends. Inside the house, the family lived inward, cut off, controlled, and increasingly disconnected. For Robert and Michael Bever, that isolation became a breeding ground. They spent countless hours online, absorbing violent media, reading forums, and obsessing over mass killers. Columbine was not a tragedy to them. It was a benchmark, something to surpass. They did not want to live ordinary lives. They wanted their names remembered forever. Their writings later revealed the truth. They dreamed of killing hundreds. They fantasized about becoming more infamous than any shooter before them. And in their minds, their own family was not off limits. It was the opening act. Months before the murders, the brothers began preparing. They stockpiled knives, tactical gear, and supplies. They wrote plans, they discussed kill counts, they imagined headlines. Their parents. and siblings were not seen as people. They were obstacles to a larger goal. On the night of July 22, 2015, the plan began. Their father, David Bever, was attacked first. He was stabbed repeatedly inside his own home. His wife, April, tried to intervene, but Michael turned on her, continuing the assault until she collapsed. The violence was intimate, sustained, and relentless. Then the brothers moved through the house. They attacked their siblings one by one: Daniel, Christopher, Victoria, children who had gone to bed expecting safety, expecting family. 5 members of the Bever family were murdered that night. But not everyone died. Crystal Bever, their 13-year-old sister, was stabbed multiple times but refused to give up. Bleeding and terrified, she reached a phone and dialed 911. In a whisper, she told the operator that her brothers were killing everyone. That call changed everything. When police arrived minutes later, the house was silent. Officers moved cautiously through blood-soaked rooms. They found Crystal barely alive. They found Autumn, just 2 years old, unharmed in her crib. And in the garage, they found Robert and Michael Bever, covered in blood, still holding knives. They did not run. They did not resist. The investigation uncovered a level of planning that stunned even seasoned detectives. Police seized computers filled with documents detailing their obsession with mass murder. They had written about surpassing Columbine, about launching a nationwide killing spree, about how murdering their family would give them access to vehicles and weapons. Their parents and siblings had been step 1. When questioned, Robert spoke openly. He said he had wanted to kill since childhood. He described the murders as destiny. There was no remorse. Michael, younger but equally involved, admitted his role without hesitation. At trial, prosecutors laid out the full scope of the betrayal. Jurors heard Crystal's 911 call. They listened as she described being attacked by her own brothers. Her testimony became the emotional center of the case, a living reminder that this massacre had been stopped only by sheer will. Robert Bever was convicted and sentenced to 5 life sentences without the possibility of parole. Michael Bever, tried as an adult despite his age, received the same. Both will die in prison. The house itself became a wound in the community. For years, it sat abandoned, a reminder of what had happened inside. Eventually, it was torn down and replaced with a memorial park honoring the victims: David, April, Daniel, Christopher, Victoria, a place of reflection where a family once lived. Crystal survived, carrying scars both visible and hidden. Autumn grew up without parents, without siblings, knowing only that 2 brothers destroyed everything for the sake of being remembered. They wanted to be legends. Instead, they became a warning. And yet, even after a massacre driven by the hunger for fame, the next story proves something even more disturbing, because the next son did not want attention at all. He wanted money, and he was willing to kill his father over an amount most people spend without thinking. Manhattan, New York, 2015. By the time this story reaches its breaking point, the violence no longer looks chaotic or emotional. It looks transactional, cold, precise. Because this son did not kill out of rage, jealousy, or desperation. He killed because he felt entitled, and because, for the first time in his life, someone finally told him no. Thomas Gilbert Jr. had everything most people spend their lives chasing: wealth, access, an Ivy League education. He grew up surrounded by privilege, raised in Manhattan's elite circles, where money solved problems and consequences were often optional. His father, Thomas Gilbert Sr., was a successful hedge fund manager. His mother, Shelley, lived a life insulated from ordinary struggle. Their son, known to everyone as Tommy, was expected to follow that path. On paper, he did. He graduated from Princeton. He lived in a luxury apartment in Chelsea. He surfed, worked out, and socialized. To outsiders, he looked like a young man enjoying the rewards of success, but underneath that image was a truth his parents had been funding for years. Tommy did not work. He had no career, no income, no direction. Instead, his parents paid for everything: rent, food, lifestyle. On top of that, his father sent him a monthly allowance of $3,000. It was meant to give him space to figure things out. What it really did was remove every incentive to grow up. By early 2015, Thomas Gilbert Sr. had reached his limit. He decided to reduce the allowance, not eliminate it, not cut his son off entirely, just reduce it by $200. That decision would cost him his life. On January 4th, 2015, Shelley Gilbert left the family's Beekman Place apartment after receiving a call from her son. Tommy asked her to go out and buy him a sandwich and a soda. It sounded trivial, ordinary. She agreed, unaware she was being deliberately removed from the scene. Once she was gone, Tommy walked into his father's bedroom, carrying a Glock handgun inside a paper bag. He raised the weapon and fired a single shot into his father's head. There was no struggle, no argument, no final words. After the shot, Tommy carefully placed the gun on his father's chest, staging the scene to resemble a suicide. He then waited. When Shelley returned, she found her husband dead and called emergency services, her voice breaking as she tried to understand what she was seeing. At first glance, it looked exactly like what Tommy wanted it to look like, a tragic self-inflicted death. But investigators moved quickly. They tracked Tommy to his apartment in Chelsea. What they found there shattered the suicide narrative. Inside were multiple firearms, illegal, magazines, and ammunition. This was not a man caught in grief. This was someone prepared for violence. Financial records told the rest of the story. Tommy had been living a lie similar to the sons before him. He told friends he worked in finance. He spoke about investments and deals. In reality, he had no job and no income. Everything he had came from his father. At trial, prosecutors laid out the motive with brutal simplicity. This was not mental illness. This was entitlement. A grown man who believed he was owed a lifestyle, and when that lifestyle was threatened, he chose execution. Shelley Gilbert testified through tears. She told the jury how her son had manipulated her, sending her out of the apartment so he could be alone with his father. That detail landed heavily. This was not impulsive. It was planned. The defense attempted to argue mental instability, introducing psychiatric history and claims of paranoia. But the prosecution cut through it in closing arguments with a line that echoed through the courtroom. He did not kill because he was sick. He killed because he wanted money. The jury deliberated for just one day. Thomas Gilbert Jr. was found guilty of second-degree murder and weapons charges. In 2019, he was sentenced to 30 years to life in prison. The judge's words were direct and unflinching. You lived a life of privilege, and instead of gratitude, you chose destruction. As of the mid-2020s, Thomas Gilbert Jr. remains incarcerated. No trust fund, no ocean views, no curated image to maintain. Just a prison cell and the knowledge that $200 was the price he placed on his father's life. And if this story feels shocking in its simplicity, the next one strips away even that. Because the next son did not act on impulse or entitlement alone. He wrote it all down first. Knoxville, Tennessee, 2016. By this point, a pattern has already formed. Lies, dependence, fear of losing, support. But the next story takes that pattern and pushes it into something far more calculated, far more chilling. Because this son did not just think about killing his parents. He rehearsed it. He outlined it. He wrote it down like instructions. Thanksgiving is supposed to be a time of reunion. A moment when families come together, set aside conflicts, and share a table. In late November of 2016, Joel Michael Guy Jr. arrived at his parents' home in Knoxville for the holiday weekend. To his parents, Joel Sr. and Lisa Guy, it looked like a normal visit. Their son coming home, family time, gratitude. What they did not know was that he had already decided they would not survive it. Joel Jr. was 28 years old, unemployed, and completely dependent on his parents. His father had worked as a pipeline engineer. His mother held a stable position in human resources. For years, they paid his bills, covered his expenses, and kept him afloat long after. Adulthood should have forced independence, but that support was coming to an end. In the weeks leading up to Thanksgiving, Joel's parents had made a decision. They were going to cut him off financially. They wanted him to stand on his own. To Joel Jr., that felt like betrayal. Not guidance, not boundaries, betrayal. What makes this case uniquely disturbing is what investigators later found in his bedroom, a notebook. Prosecutors would call it the Book of Premeditation. Inside, Joel had written step-by-step plans for murder. He described how he would ambush his father, how he would ensure his mother came home separately so she could be attacked alone. He wrote about dismemberment, about using chemicals to dissolve bodies, about how long it would take for flesh to break down. This was not fantasy. It was preparation. On Saturday, November 26, 2016, Joel Sr. was in the home's exercise room. Joel Jr. attacked him there, stabbing him repeatedly in a sustained assault. The man who had supported him for nearly 3 decades died on the floor of his own home. Hours later, Lisa Guy returned from shopping. She carried groceries inside, unaware that her husband was already dead. Joel followed the plan he had written. She was attacked and killed shortly after entering the house. But Joel did not stop at murder. Following the instructions in his notebook, he began dismembering their bodies. Limbs were separated. Body parts were placed into tubs filled with chemicals. Investigators would later describe the scene as one of the most horrific they had ever encountered. The smell of bleach, decay, and chemicals filled the house. This was not rage. This was execution followed by process. What ultimately exposed him was not guilt or confession or panic. It was routine. Lisa Guy did not show up for work on Monday. That was enough to raise concern. She was reliable, predictable. Her absence triggered a welfare check. When police entered the wounded home, they walked into what one officer later called a house of horrors. Joel Jr. was arrested shortly after. At trial, prosecutors laid out the evidence piece by piece. The notebook was read aloud in court, line by line, instruction by instruction. Jurors listened as the plan unfolded exactly as written. Surveillance footage showed Joel purchasing supplies. Walmart cameras captured him calmly buying bandages after injuring himself during the killings. The contrast was devastating. The defense offered no narrative that could survive the facts. This was not an argument, not self-defense, not a mental break. This was entitlement turned lethal. In 2020, Joel Michael Guy Jr. was convicted on 2 counts of first-degree murder, along with additional charges related to the abuse of the bodies. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. At sentencing, the judge did not soften his words. He said there was no potential for rehabilitation. That Joel showed pride, not remorse. That no amount of time could undo what had been done. As of the mid-2020s, Joel Michael Guy Jr. remains incarcerated. His notebook still exists. His parents do not. And if this case feels like the coldest version of planning imaginable, the next one adds something new. Because the next son did not hide his crime at all. He confessed in real time to strangers. Markham, Ontario, 2019. By now, the pattern is unmistakable. A life built on lies, a fear of exposure, parents who believed in a future that never existed. But this time, the story does not end with denial or staging. This son did something far more unsettling. He told the truth immediately, just not to the police. Menhaz Zaman was 23 years old and lived in the basement of his parents' home in Markham, Ontario. He was quiet, withdrawn, a heavy gamer who spent most of his time online. To his family, he was the perfect son. Respectful, focused, nearly finished with an engineering degree at York University. His parents spoke proudly of his upcoming graduation. His grandmother prayed for him every night. His younger sister encouraged him, believing his hard work was about to pay off. None of it was real. In truth, Menhaz had dropped out of university years earlier. There were no classes, no exams, no degree. His days were spent sleeping, gaming, and drifting further away from the identity he had invented. Every question from his family required another lie, another excuse, another fabricated deadline. By the summer of 2019, the lies were collapsing under their own weight. Graduation was approaching. Invitations were expected. The moment of exposure was unavoidable. Menhaz could not face it. On July 27, 2019, his family returned home one by one. His grandmother, Feroza Begum, entered first. She never made it past the threshold. Menhaz attacked and killed her almost immediately. Later, his mother, Maimuna Zaman, came home still wearing her prayer clothes, groceries in her hands. She believed she was walking into safety. Instead, she was murdered by the son she had raised with patience and devotion. Hours later, his sister Sumaya returned. She was killed as well. Finally, his father, Monir Zaman, came home from work. tired, expecting dinner, expecting family. Menhaz killed him too. 4 generations erased inside a single house. But instead of hiding what he had done, Menhaz sat down at his computer. He logged into Discord, a gaming chat platform where he spent much of his life. In a small chat room, he typed a message that stunned the people reading it. He said he had slaughtered his entire family. At first, other users assumed it was dark humor, an attempt at shock. But Menhaz continued. He explained his motive. He said he could not live knowing his family would see him as a failure. When disbelief remained, he posted photos, images of his murdered family, members. Someone finally called police. When officers arrived at the Zaman home, the doors were locked. They forced entry and found exactly what Menhaz had described online. He did not resist. He did not deny it. He admitted to everything. The investigation confirmed the motive. There was no financial dispute, no abuse, no inheritance plan. Just a young man who had constructed an identity he could not maintain, and who chose annihilation over honesty. At trial, prosecutors emphasized the cruelty of the deception. His family had supported him emotionally and financially for years. His mother prayed for him daily. His father worked long shifts, believing his son would soon graduate. His sister believed in him completely. Menhaz pleaded guilty to 4 counts of first-degree murder. In court, transcripts of his Discord messages were read aloud, word for word, the casual tone, the confession, the lack of urgency, the detachment. When given a chance to speak, Menhaz offered an apology. It was brief, hollow. The judge was unmoved. He sentenced Menhaz Zaman to life in prison with no possibility of parole for 40 years, one of the harshest sentences available under Canadian law. Within the Bangladeshi Canadian community, grief turned into disbelief. Relatives struggled to comprehend how a son raised with care and opportunity could erase his entire family to protect a lie. As of the mid-2020s, Menhaz Zaman remains incarcerated. No degree, no future, no family left to disappoint. And if confessing online feels like the end of denial, the next story shows something even darker. Because the next son did not just kill his family, he tried to blame one of them for all of it. Chuluota, Florida, 2019. By now, the stories have stripped away excuses one by one. Lies, fear, fame, money. But this next case introduces something far more corrosive. Obsession. Not with power or reputation, but with a fantasy so consuming that reality itself became disposable. Grant Amato was 29 years old, a former registered nurse, intelligent, articulate, and for much of his life, the son his parents believed would succeed. His family lived in a quiet home in Chuluota, Florida. Chad and Margaret Amato had supported Grant repeatedly, stepping in whenever his life began to fall apart. His older brother Cody did the same, lending money and emotional support, believing Grant could still turn things around. Behind that support was a secret draining the family dry. Grant had become obsessed with a woman he met through an overseas webcam site. Her name was Sylvie. She was not his girlfriend. She was a cam model. Their interactions were transactional, timed, paid for by the minute. But in Grant's mind, the relationship was real. He sent her money, then more money. When his own funds ran out, he turned to his family. He stole from his brother first, more than $60,000, then from his parents, roughly $150,000, including money tied to a loan against their home. In total, prosecutors later showed that Grant sent more than $200,000 to the woman he believed loved him. Eventually, the truth came out. His family confronted him. The money was gone. The lies were exposed. Grant was sent to a treatment facility to address what they believed was an addiction. For a moment, it looked like it might work. It did not. After returning home, Grant went right back to the fantasy, right back to the cam site, right back to the deception. And when his parents made it clear that the financial support was over, Grant reached the end of the road. On the night of January 24th, 2019, Grant armed himself with a Jericho 9mm handgun that had gone missing from the home. What followed wiped out the entire Amato family. Grant killed his father, Chad Amato. He killed his mother, Margaret Amato, and then he killed his brother, Cody Amato. After the murders, Grant did not flee in panic. He staged the scene. Investigators said he attempted to make it look like Cody had murdered their parents and then taken his own life. He placed the gun near Cody's body to sell the illusion. He allegedly used his father's phone to lure Cody home before killing him, setting up the final act of the lie. Then he left the house. The next morning, deputies arrived to conduct a welfare check. Inside, they found 3 bodies, a family erased. Grant was located later at a hotel. He was calm, detached. He did not ask about his family. The investigation unraveled his story quickly. Surveillance footage placed him where he said he was not. Financial records traced the stolen money. Forensic evidence contradicted the staged narrative. And digital data revealed something even more disturbing. After killing his family, Grant allegedly accessed online banking using his father's fingerprint. He continued interacting with his online fantasy as if nothing had happened. Prosecutors also introduced evidence showing that Grant connected a thumb drive to a computer late that night. The drive contained hundreds of photos and videos of Sylvie, explicit material preserved even as his family lay dead. At trial, the motive was framed clearly and relentlessly. Grant Amato did not kill out of fear. He did not kill because he was abused. He did not kill in self-defense. He killed because his family stood between him and the fantasy he refused to let go of. The jury heard how his parents had sacrificed financially and emotionally to save him, how his brother had tried to help him recover, and how Grant repaid that loyalty with theft, deception, and murder. The state sought the death penalty, but the jury could not unanimously agree. One holdout was enough. Grant Amato was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. His appeals failed. The conviction stood. As of the mid-2020s, Grant Amato remains in Florida custody. No fantasy, no screen, no escape, just the reality he tried to erase. And if obsession feels like the final extreme, the next case proves otherwise. Because the next son was not driven by lies, money, fame, or fantasy. He was 14 years old. Elkmont, Alabama, 2019. By this point, the idea of a son destroying his family already feels unbearable. But the next story forces an even darker realization. Age is not a safeguard. Innocence is not a shield. Sometimes, the person capable of wiping out an entire household is not an adult hardened by years of failure, but a child who has barely begun life. In the early morning hours of September 2nd, 2019, deputies arrived at a quiet home in Elkmont, Alabama. Inside, they found a scene that immediately defied comprehension. 5 people were dead. There were no signs of forced entry, no broken doors, no evidence of an intruder fleeing into the night. One person inside the house was still alive. Mason Sisk was 14 years old. At first, Mason told police a story designed to point outward. He claimed he had been in the basement playing video games when he heard gunshots. He said that when he came upstairs, he found his family members injured and noticed a vehicle driving away from the home. It was the kind of story investigators hear often. Vague, directionless, convenient. But it did not hold. As detectives reconstructed timelines and examined physical evidence, cracks appeared quickly. The escape route did not make sense. The supposed intruder left no trail. Ballistics told a different story. And the simple fact remained. Mason was the only person left alive in a house where 5 others had been killed. Under pressure, the story collapsed. Mason eventually admitted there was no fleeing vehicle, no stranger, no outside attacker. He confessed that he had killed his entire family himself. The victims included his father, his stepmother, and 3 younger siblings. Children who had gone to sleep believing they were safe in their own beds. Children who trusted the person sleeping under the same roof. What followed was not just a murder investigation, but a psychological excavation. When asked why, Mason gave an explanation that disturbed nearly everyone who heard it. He told investigators he was fed up with the environment in the home. He spoke about constant arguing, about tension, about his father coming home drunk on a regular basis. He claimed he did not want his younger siblings growing up in what he described as a toxic household. It was not framed as a single argument or a moment of rage. It was something he said had been building over time in his mind. For prosecutors, motive mattered less than outcome. This was a capital murder case involving multiple victims, including children under the age of 14. Because of that, the state moved to have Mason tried as an adult. The decision ignited immediate debate. Some argued that a 14-year-old brain is not fully developed, that impulse control and long-term reasoning are incomplete, that sentencing a child to die in prison represents a failure of society itself. Others pointed to the facts. 5 people were dead. The killings were carried out while the victims slept. There was planning. There was execution. And the youngest victims never had a chance. The case dragged on for years, and at one point, it nearly collapsed. In September of 2022, Mason's first trial ended in a mistrial after a major digital evidence issue erupted in court. Data from his stepmother's phone had been newly accessed during the trial after being unlocked with federal assistance. The sudden availability of that evidence forced the judge to declare a mistrial. When the case returned to court in 2023, it came back heavier. Jurors were shown interrogation footage where Mason admitted he had not been truthful at first. They heard about his behavior after arrest, including messages he sent from jail to a former girlfriend or friend. Those messages became a turning point. In them, Mason floated alternative versions of events, suggesting he had been forced or that someone else had been involved. In others, he veered into deeply unsettling territory, boasting about speed and accuracy, making comments about being a contract assassin, and discussing the killings in ways prosecutors argued showed a shocking lack of remorse. On April 27, 2023, the jury returned its verdict, guilty. Mason Sisk was convicted of capital murder. Sentencing followed months later, on September 7, 2023. Because Mason was a juvenile at the time of the crimes, the death penalty was not an option. The court had 2 choices: life in prison with the possibility of parole, or life in prison without parole. The judge chose the latter. Mason Sisk was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. In November of 2024, the Alabama Court of Criminal Appeals upheld both the conviction and the sentence. The decision stood. Today, Mason Sisk remains incarcerated. He entered prison as a teenager. He will never be released. His case sits at the intersection of every fear society has about youth violence and family annihilation. It forces a question no one wants to answer. If a child can do this, what does evil actually look like? And with that question hanging in the air, there is only one thing left: to step back and confront what all of these stories have in common. Because the most disturbing part is not how different these sons were, it is how similar they turned out to be. Across different countries, cultures, and backgrounds, these stories share a single, terrifying truth. None of these families expected the danger to come from inside the home. These sons were not strangers in the dark. They were trusted, supported, loved, and in every case, something fractured long before the violence began. Lies piled up. Entitlement grew unchecked. Obsession replaced responsibility. And when reality finally demanded accountability, these sons chose annihilation over truth. What lingers after the details fade is not just the brutality, but the betrayal. Parents who sacrificed everything. Siblings who trusted without question. Futures erased in silence. These crimes do not offer neat explanations or comforting answers. They leave only warnings about denial, about unchecked dependency, about what happens when reality is avoided for too long. If you value deep, uncompromising documentaries like this, make sure you subscribe. New stories are coming, and they go even deeper. And before you go, tell me, where are you watching from?